The Specialized Stumpjumper EVO is an extremely popular bike these days, and chances are if you own one of these, you've probably wondered if a coil shock feels good on this bike. So in this 3-part video series, I'm installing a coil shock on my Stumpy EVO, riding it, and letting you know how it feels. For the first part, we'll calculate a spring rate and get the shock installed, so let's get to work. Coil shock coming in hot! What's up, guys? My name is Mike. I'm the owner of The Lost Co, and I spend a lot of time on the phone and emails helping people with the Stumpjumper EVO and what types of modifications will hopefully make this thing ride better. I've been riding this thing with the Fox Float Factory X on here for a bit, back to back with the RockShox Super Deluxe Air Shock. The Super Deluxe that I was sent has HBO hydraulic bottom out feature and also a Stumpjumper EVO specific tune. Not available in the aftermarket, which I wish it was, but for side-by-side comparisons of the Float X and Super Deluxe, that's what I've been riding, but that's gonna be for a later video. In this video, we're actually going to be putting a coil shock on this bike. Like I said, I spend a lot of time with customers talking about potentially changing out suspension components, and lots of people wonder if a coil shock is a great route with the Stumpy EVO platform. And so we have so many customers asking about this, I literally went and built up a Stumpjumper EVO so I can help people a little bit better with their questions. So this is my Stumpy EVO, just built this thing up. It's a custom build with some cool parts on it. It rides like a dream. I'm really enjoying it so far. And so yeah, time to start messing around with it, making some videos. So first up, coil shock. One thing to note before slapping a coil shock on your Stumpjumper EVO, Levo, etc., the shock link extension, clevis, yoke, whatever you want to call it, this suspension design layout puts a lot more stress and side loads on shocks than other designs out there. Coil shocks have a lot smaller diameter stanchions than air shocks, so overall they're just less rigid when flexing them like this, and so some models of coil shocks are just straight up not approved to work on this type of suspension design layout. You can actually Google Stumpjumper EVO broken coil shock and you will see pictures like this where the stanchion is just straight up snapped in half. Now that doesn't mean that those models of shocks like suck or something like that, like they can't hold up to the abuse. It's just this design, this layout just does add a lot of side load, a lot of extra stress onto shocks, and coil shocks sometimes by their specific design, how the manufacturer makes them, just can't handle it. So there are a lot of models out there that are just straight up like not approved for this type of suspension layout per the manufacturer. So check out this list for a quick reference on which shocks are and are not approved by the manufacturer for this type of layout. If you're watching this video in the distant future, just check with the manufacturer because maybe there's a revision that came out or a new model or something that does work with this type of layout. So just check beforehand. But this is just a quick reference list at the time of filming this video. I actually called everyone to confirm this. So, okay, let's continue. So I got this RockShox Super Deluxe Ultimate Coil from our shop general manager, Steve. He's been riding this thing for a bit, actually on his Stumpjumper EVO. He likes it, so he gave it to me to borrow and make a video with and see how I like it. So he weighs a bit less than me. This currently has a 400-pound spring on it. And so step one is I need to calculate a spring. So I'm gonna walk over to the computer in a second. At thelostco.com, our website, we've got our own spring calculator that we've built off of some other spring calculators that we've used in the past. And we've built this in a slightly different way to kind of reflect the numbers that we have seen come out of the other ones and what we've had to do to kind of manipulate them. Now, besides the actual spring, already got the mounting hardware figured out. This is M8x20 mounting hardware in the front eyelet. And then the rear, it's gonna use a DU bushing pressed into the rear eyelet with this kind of proprietary metal specialized hardware that kind of pops in there, a couple little sleeves. So got that all already figured out. Currently 400-pound spring. I'm gonna take this off. Let's go over to the computer and calculate a spring with my weight. All right, quick disclaimer before we actually punch some numbers into the spring calculator. I just want to let you know that spring calculators are definitely just a tool to use to get you a good starting point for a spring rate. So this calculator that we have built on our website, we built this with some real-world feedback that we've seen, you know, the results from with other calculators, and we feel like this has been a little bit more accurate with most applications. However, all spring calculators are going to react differently to different bikes just because all bikes and their suspension designs are different. So again, spring calculators are just to help you get a good starting point, because if you buy a brand new bike and the manufacturer doesn't have a spring rate chart on their website like most don't. You don't know if you're gonna start with a 300-pound spring or a 700-pound spring, so spring calculator is, again, just a tool to give you a good starting point for a spring. So let's hop in, enter some info, and see what we get. All right, I am on our spring calculator. You go to our website at thelostco.com, scroll all the way to the bottom, click on spring calculator, and here we are. So I've entered my information. It's super easy. You've got your weight, your wheel travel, and your stroke. And so the general sag that you're going to be shooting for with most shocks on most bikes, most applications, is 28-30% sag, right around there. So we're going to enter our info and see what it gets us. So I'm 155 pounds with all my gear on. Rear wheel travel, 150 millimeters on the Stumpjumper EVO. And the shock stroke on that bike is 55 millimeters. When you click calculate, you've got a result of 477. Now you're probably gonna say, wait a second, 477, but the RockShox springs only come in 50-pound increments and I can only get 450 or 500. So that's where you're going to have to make some decisions. So a number like this, I'm going to decide if I want to spring up or spring down depending on my riding style. Me, myself, I grew up riding stupid 20-inch BMX bikes at skate parks, and so my riding style is a little bit more on the back end of the bike, a little bit more pop, a little bit more support. And so with that being said, I'm gonna spring up. I'm gonna go to the stiffer spring choice of 500 pounds. Now, if I grew up racing DH and I have a little bit more of my weight on the front end of the bike and maybe run a more supportive fork setup, but like my shock to be softer and get more traction, I'd probably spring down to a 450. Now, yes, there are some other springs out there that are either adjustable or progressive, things like that, but those are expensive. Those are like 130 bucks most of the time. I don't want to spend money on an expensive spring when I'm just using a tool to get me a good starting point, because then if that spring isn't right, then I'm just gonna have to go buy another $130 spring. So I'm just gonna start with those 50-pound increment springs. I'm gonna go grab a 500 off the shelf, put it on the bike, and then measure my sag. So we're going to get the on-paper information, bring it to the real world, and see what the sag actually measured out to be, so we have some information to build off of before hitting the trail. So let's do that. All right, RockShox springs, 47.5 to 55, and got lucky. 500 pound is the first one of the box. Usually I'm digging through the box for 20 minutes, so let's go slap this on and put on the bike. Spring. Taking the springs off of most coil shocks is pretty dang easy. Just loosen it up, take off the lower collar, and then, yeah, old spring's gonna come off. So that was the 400 pound spring rate. I think Steve weighs about 130, 135. So I'm like 155, I'm gonna pop on this 500 pound spring. And for the preload, I'm really just gonna get this spring on there snug and maybe a half turn past that. We don't really like to use preload as a huge tool when it comes to setting sag. This actually has a minimum of 2 turns and a maximum of 5. So mounting hardware's on, let's just slap it on the bike real quick. Out with the old, well, it's new, the old one. Out with the new, in with the new. Coil Shock coming in hot. All right. The Stumpjumper EVO is pretty easy to install a shock on. The hardware is all pressed in. There's no like little spacers or anything like that are gonna fall out. So definitely super easy if you're doing this at home and inexperienced with swapping out suspension parts and things like that. So this went in very, very easy. Cool. All right, let's pop this thing out of the stand. 500 pound spring. Measure some sag. When measuring sag on any shock, you basically need a sag ring that, gets pushed down when you sag your weight down into the suspension and compress it with your weight sitting on it without pushing into it. So instead of a normal air shock with a very easily exposed sag ring, what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna just use the bottom out bumper as a sag ring. So I'm gonna reach down, push the bottom out bumper all the way up to the top when the shock is uncompressed before getting going. Make sure that the lockout or, pedal platform switch is totally open and soft. And then it is also nice to have your compression, your low speed compression, fully soft too, just so the shock is nice and soft to easily sag into it without resistance from the damper. So there's like 500 different ways to measure your sag. We all know that. The preferred way that I like to do it is I like to basically just sit with my back straight and sag down into it and get my feet off the ground once I feel like I stopped sagging in, and then lightly put my feet back down and stand up. Now, there's some other ways to do it. Some people with different riding styles that like to have a little bit more weight towards the front. Maybe they even have a friend hold the bike and help them so that they can get a little bit more weight on the front and balance on the bike in a more neutral riding position. But no matter which way you do it, which way you put your weight, if you're standing or sitting, just make sure that you're getting your sag readings consistently between different spring rates so that you can actually get a realistic reading between different spring rates, so you're not just throwing them on, measuring the sag differently, and then not getting a consistent reading with the method of measuring sag that you're using. All right, so after hopping off the bike and looking down at the sag gradients that are actually labeled right on the stanchion on RockShox shocks, thank you guys for making that so easy. This is definitely on the stiff side. So 500-pound spring gave me right around 23% sag when I measured it the way that I pretty much always measure my sag on all my bikes with Coil Shocks. So definitely on the stiff side. I think this is a great example to show what a spring calculator is for, because like I said, 23%, not horrible. However, we've got this 400-pound spring sitting over here, and since this is a little bit on the stiff side, I'm actually pretty interested in throwing that on there and measuring the sag and seeing what it comes out to be before I actually hit the trails, because if we can get closer to that 30% sag that is kind of more favorable, then I think I'd rather start there. So this is actually a really awesome time for all you Stumpjumper EVO owners out there to see a realistic spring calculation actually happening in the real world and not just on paper. So, all right, let's pop the 400 on there, see what that comes out to be. All right, 400-pound spring. Yeah, no, now I'm like right at 30%, like 28, 29, 30%, right in there. It's really close to 30%. So that's actually more favorable in most cases. Most people want right around 30% sag. So this goes to show that spring calculators are there to give you a good starting point, but not necessarily always going to be correct, especially in this case. The Stumpjumper EVO is going to fall in that group of bikes that react a little bit differently to spring calculators, and maybe spring calculators just run them a little bit high, depending on how the bike's actual leverage ratio and things like that are. We've ran our spring calculator with a whole bunch of bikes, and most of the time it's pretty dang spot on, but again, you can't make these things perfect for every bike. And also, we actually made this spring calculator, so we're not trying to hide anything and say like, we've got the one that's perfect or anything like that. We actually plugged the numbers into another really popular one, TF Tune, which we actually used for years, and that actually gave me basically the same results. So it just, again, goes to show that no matter who is making the spring calculator or what numbers they're basing it on, it's never gonna be perfect. So just use it as a general starting point. So I'm actually gonna hit the trail with this 400-pound spring at like that 28, 29% sag and see how it actually feels on the trails. So let's go do that. Make sure you subscribe to our channel with notifications turned on so you don't miss part 2, where I ride this new Coil Shock setup on the trails and explain my setup process and what I feel for on the trail. Then in part 3, I'll do a full review on how the Stumpjumper EVO feels with the Coil Shock and help you figure out if this is a great option for you or if you should stick with an air shock. If you'd like to purchase a shock or any other parts to upgrade or service your Stumpy EVO or any other bike, head over to our website at thelostco.com, where we have a massive catalog of goodies for your bike. If you have any questions, hit us up with a call or email and we'll be happy to help. I'll see you over at part 2.